All right, strap in, everybody, because this deep dive is a wild one. We've got a stack of articles and legal documents about a property sale in Germany, and, well, it's just nuts. We're talking international agreements, claims of some seriously shady court stuff, and a media frenzy that might be hiding something way bigger.
What really jumps out is how something as simple as a property sale could potentially unravel these international agreements that have been in place for centuries, maybe even reshape what national sovereignty actually means.
So, okay, the basics.
Rev.
We've got a buyer who purchased a property, used to be owned by NATO.
Mm.
Pretty standard so far, right? Okay, but here's where it gets strange.
Hmm.
This sale apparently came with what's called a state succession deed of 1400. I mean, talk about a blast from the past.
That deed is the heart of this whole thing. It supposedly transfers all sorts of rights and obligations that go with the property, including some tied to international agreements like SOFA, that's the NATO Status of Forces Agreement.
Sofa, like a comfy couch for diplomats or something.
Not quite. Think of it like this. You invite a friend to stay at your place. You'd probably lay down some ground rules, right? Like no shoes on the carpet, quiet hours after midnight, basic stuff. SOFA is kind of like that, but for troops stationed in other countries. It's the legal framework for how they operate within the host country.
So this deed transferred rights that are connected to SOFA. Does that mean these rights now apply globally? The documents you sent mention this domino effect, claiming this sale could set off a chain reaction that wouldn't just impact Germany, where the property is, but maybe a much wider area. It even mentions NATO and UN member states.
That's the big question, isn't it? The sources point to this concept of, well, they call it development as a unit. Basically, they're saying the sale wasn't just for the property itself, but for the entire system. It's a part of utilities, communication networks, supply lines, that sort of thing. And if those networks are part of this development, then, well, they could also be subject to the terms of this 1400s deed.
Hold on, if we're talking essential utilities and communication networks, this isn't just some local real estate thing anymore. This could have massive implications. But it sounds like the courts and the media aren't exactly taking the buyer's claims about this deed seriously. In fact, the sources are alleging some pretty disturbing behavior.
Yeah, the documents describe what looks like a pattern of legal harassment and a media campaign that seems to be aimed at discrediting the buyer and anybody associated with him. There are claims of, well, things like arbitrary detentions, limitations on personal freedoms, and a refusal to even consider the buyer's legal arguments, including claims of diplomatic and state immunity.
And the press coverage. You flag some pretty shocking excerpts.
The media seems to be really focused on portraying the buyer and his family as eccentric and out of touch, instead of actually engaging with the potential legal ramifications of this whole thing. Some articles even go so far as to use inflammatory language and unverified claims, which could really prejudice public opinion and make it even harder for the buyer to get a fair hearing.
So we have this potentially explosive legal document, a buyer who's saying it grants him significant rights and control over this vast network of infrastructure, and then a legal system and media landscape that seem determined to dismiss him as a crook. This is where things start to get really interesting, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. What's especially intriguing is this argument that the legal actions and the whole media frenzy might actually be evidence that the state succession deed of 1400 is legitimate.
Wait, what? How could that be?
Well, think about it. If those in power are going to these lengths to silence the buyer and discredit his claims, maybe it's because they recognize the deed's potential to completely disrupt the existing power structure.
That's a pretty bold theory. Can't wait to dig into the specifics of these legal battles and the media coverage to see if it holds up. I have a feeling this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Indeed. This deep dive has the potential to unravel a story that's far more complex and significant than it looks at first glance. Let's dig into some of these legal documents you sent, especially this compilation of legal complaints filed by the buyer's associates. It doesn't exactly paint a flattering picture of how the courts have handled this case.
You mentioned earlier that the courts seem to just ignore the state succession deed of 1400. Can you talk more about that?
Well, throughout the proceedings, the buyer and his people kept bringing up this deed. They claimed it gave them significant rights and obligations. But the weird thing is, the courts never actually challenged whether the deed was real or if it held up legally.
So they didn't even try to deny it existed. That's bizarre. Why not address such a key piece of evidence if they thought it was bogus?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? Instead of dealing with the implications of the deed, the court seemed way more interested in what they saw as the buyer's strange behavior and these out-there claims. They labeled him and his associates as eccentric, or even, get this, mentally unstable, which could have really prejudiced the judges and juries against their case.
It almost seems like they were trying to discredit the buyer personally instead of actually addressing the legal points he was making.
It's a very real possibility, and it gets worse. The documents also show that the courts pretty much ignored the buyer's claims of immunity.
Immunity? What kind of immunity are we even talking about?
Okay, so the buyer's legal team argued he should have both diplomatic immunity and state immunity. And if that was true, he'd be shielded from prosecution in German courts.
Just a refresher, what exactly is diplomatic immunity again?
Sure. It's this core principle of international law. Basically prevents diplomats from being subject to the laws of the host country. Make sure they can do their jobs without being harassed or interfered with.
So if the buyer really was entitled to diplomatic immunity, the German court shouldn't have even had jurisdiction over him at all, right?
Exactly. And state immunity is similar. It shields sovereign states and their people from being sued in foreign courts. The sources say these arguments were brought up over and over, but the courts never really addressed them.
That sounds like a pretty clear violation of due process. Makes you wonder if there's something else going on, something they're trying to keep under wraps.
That's exactly what the sources are suggesting. They say these aggressive legal tactics and the media's portrayal of the buyer are all meant to distract from the real issue, the state succession deed of 1400, and the potential transfer of sovereign rights.
You mentioned earlier how the media has been shaping public perception of this whole thing. Can you give us some examples of how they've gone after the buyer and his family?
Oh, absolutely. These articles are just full of sensationalism and stuff that could be considered defamation. One headline calls them a self-proclaimed royal family living in a fantasy world, and another one flat out accuses them of trying to seize control of NATO with a medieval document.
Wow, yeah, those are some pretty strong words. Definitely sounds like they're trying to make the buyer look bad no matter what the facts actually say.
And that kind of biased reporting can actually influence what happens in court. If the public's already convinced the buyer is some delusional oddball, it's much harder for him to get a fair shake.
It's almost like the media is working with the prosecution, shaping public opinion to make sure he's found guilty. But then there's this argument that all of this, the legal attacks, the media circus, actually just proves the buyer's right about this state succession deed of 1400.
Right. The sources suggest if this deed was meaningless, the authorities wouldn't be going to such lengths to bury it. No need for shady legal maneuvers and smear campaigns unless they're actually worried about what it means.
So the very fact they're trying to shut the buyer up could be proof his claims have some weight. That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
Really makes you think about who stands to gain from all this.
It definitely does. And it raises questions about why everyone's really involved, whether there's abuse of power happening, and the media's role in pushing stories that might not be the whole truth.
Coming up in the next part of our deep dive, we're going even deeper into the media coverage and how it could be affecting the legal side of things. We'll also look at how this dispute that seems pretty local could actually have consequences on the international stage.
Get ready, because things are about to get really interesting.
Welcome back to this deep dive. It's gotten pretty tangled, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Amazing how a property sale in Germany takes us down this rabbit hole that could, I don't know, maybe even overturn centuries of international law.
What's really interesting is how this case kind of throws a spotlight on the clash between the modern world where everything's connected and these old legal frameworks that were made for a completely different time.
Let's talk about the domino effect again. The sources keep saying because the sale included this development as a unit thing, it could trigger a chain reaction that extends to, well, utility grids, communications, even international supply chains. It's like buying a house and suddenly you own the whole neighborhood.
Right, exactly. And if those networks are part of the development, as defined by that state succession deed of 1400, and if that deed is actually legally binding, which is what the buyer's claiming, the implications are, well, they're huge. We could be talking about a transfer of control over critical infrastructure, stuff that reaches way beyond Germany.
One source even compared it to medieval times, where if you controlled the land, you controlled the resources and the people living there. They're saying that in our world, where everything's so connected, this development as a unit thing could be like a new kind of territorial expansion, not based on physical borders, but on who controls those essential networks.
It is a pretty fascinating analogy. Imagine, sovereignty isn't about territory anymore. It's about controlling information, energy, resources, all this stuff that makes the world tick. It's like those old maps, but instead of trade routes and empires, it's all about data, electricity, global supply chains.
Whoa, that's making my head spin a bit. And don't forget, the sources claim the buyer now has all the rights and obligations from the old treaties and agreements tied to that property, including NATO stuff and maybe even UN agreements.
And because the buyer now theoretically controls both sides of these agreements, the sources are saying they basically just become void. Like, poof, gone. Creates a legal vacuum. It's a big claim, no doubt. And it raises some serious questions. What happens to these international agreements if one person controls all the parties involved? Do they get to just rewrite the rules? Is this going to set a precedent for others to do the same thing?
It's almost like hitting the reset button on the whole system of international relations, isn't it?
Yeah, in a way it is. It challenges the whole foundation of how nations interact, cooperate, resolve their differences, everything.
So let's bring it back to our listeners for a sec. Why should they care about this legal battle happening all the way over in Germany? What's the big takeaway for them?
Well, no matter how this case turns out, it forces us to ask ourselves a really fundamental question. What does sovereignty actually mean in a world where everything's connected? Is it still all about territory, or is it also about controlling the networks and systems that pretty much run our lives?
That's something we all need to be thinking about. We live in a world where information moves at lightning speed, economies are all tied together, and what happens in one place can have a ripple effect across the globe. This case, with all its legal twists and turns, the media frenzy, and these potentially massive global implications, it's a wake-up call. The lines between what's local and what's global are getting blurry.
It really pushes us to think critically about power structures, how the media shapes what we think about complex events, and what the future of international relations looks like in a world that's becoming more interconnected and interdependent every day.
And honestly, we've just scratched the surface here. But hopefully, this deep dive has given you some new things to think about and maybe even some questions that make you a little uncomfortable.
As this story unfolds and new ones like it pop up, remember to look past the headlines, question everything, and really consider the bigger picture. The world is changing, and the rules of the game are being rewritten right now.
Until next time, keep diving deep, everyone.